Good morning. Okay, woo, it's Friday, yay. Good morning, thank you for coming out to our community presentation for our ULI land study for the South Memphis area. We are knee-deep into our Parks Master Plan. So has anyone in here heard of Memphis 3.0? Yay, majority of the hands, awesome. So Memphis 3.0 is just our comprehensive plan for our city. And so what that said for parks and neighborhoods, I guess I should have said my name so you would know who I am, but I'll say that in a minute. So what the 3.0 plan said for parks and neighborhoods was just do a parks master plan. We're in the process of doing that. And with that, we invited ULI to do some things with their 10-minute walk grant. So let me introduce myself. I am Marcia Allen, Community Engagement Administrator for City of Memphis Division of Parks and Neighborhoods. The 10-minute walk grant we signed on in 2017 to make sure that we had quality parks in a 10-minute walk of all of our residents. Currently, we only have about 45% in a 10-minute walk. So we brought this lovely panel of people in to study the South Memphis area that has a lot of parks to see what we can do differently. This study will feed into our Parks Master Plan, which directly comes from our Memphis 3.0. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. James Lima.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Marcia. Good morning. So great to see so many people here, and it's been a wonderful experience connecting with so many people in the community and people in the city of Memphis. I'm James Lima. I run a real estate economic and public policy advisory firm. We work in cities around the country. This week I had the honor of serving as the chair of this panel. We've been here for 2.5 days, so we have done a little express analysis of the challenges at hand, but we're delighted to be here as part of a national study visit through the 10-minute walk campaign and the Urban Land Institute. The Urban Land Institute, some of you may know, its mission is to provide leadership in the responsible use of land and in creating and sustaining thriving communities worldwide. There are over 46,000 members globally. So one of the amazing things about ULI as a convener is that it really has this big picture view, literally like a global view, but very much a national view in the US about best practices and how each community can learn from the lessons of other communities. And so we've been able to both pull from the resources and the expertise of ULI, but also ULI brings in experts from around the country, and I'm going to introduce each of the panelists in a few moments. The other co-sponsor of our work these last couple of days is the 10-minute walk campaign. Some of you may know that, but it's a partnership between ULI, the Trust for Public Land, and the National Recreation and Park Association. The 10-minute walk, it promotes the bold idea that all people in urban America should live within a 10-minute walk to a high-quality park. More than 300 US mayors have signed on to this initiative, and so there are more and more conversations about the really important role that parks plays in vibrant and healthy and sustainable cities around the country. We'll talk a little bit about the benefits of parks. So I'm a real estate and economic advisor, but a huge part of the work that we do with partner cities and foundations and owners around the country is thinking about the really important role that parks and open space, these common spaces, the civic commons, where we come together as communities, plays as a really strategic piece of economic revitalization and community development. And so here we want to talk first and foremost about how your neighborhood parks are critical infrastructure as places for community connection. You're going to hear a lot from us urging you, do not lose these shared publicly owned spaces. These will become the organizers of the next wave of reinvestment for the vision that you have for what the community can be once again. So we're going to urge you to hold on to that. There are also places of equity and inclusion, of community engagement, environmental sustainability, and equitable economic development. We think about parks as cities building an artificial reef. So you build it, and you build it well, and then you don't really know, but over time, all sorts of tropical fish are going to populate this artificial reef, and that's the beauty of it. The job we see before you now is to make sure that there's as healthy an ecosystem as possible for a really healthy and sustainable community to continue to grow and rebound. And we've seen a lot of great work that's sort of setting the stage for that to happen. So the study area, it will be familiar to you. It's the area outlined in white at the southern part of the map. And it is an area that contains the various neighborhood parks that were identified by the Parks Division as relevant for our study today. So what struck us about the study area is how it's just minutes away from some of the other really important economic, social, and cultural hubs of activity and vitality in the city. Your downtown, your riverfront, the important cultural and recreational assets of MLK Park and the like. So we're going to talk about those connections and strengthening those connections. The study questions specifically, I'm just going to read them so that we're clear about what we were tasked with doing, is define the role of parks in South Memphis. What is the role of parks in fostering health, community development, and economic opportunity? How might a connected network of parks benefit the South Memphis community? What are relevant strategies to maintain, operate, and program neighborhood parks that are cost-effective and community-serving? And one of the kind of underlying questions that I always ask when I'm working in places like this is, what is the experience of place? In this way, each one of you is as much an expert as anyone else about placemaking and what I think of as placekeeping, because you know the places that you want to be in and that you want to return to again and again. And when you're hosting visitors or family or friends, you go to certain places that for you have meaning and that provide a variety of what I think of as rewards and places to take in the life of the city. And so how can we think about these parks both as the future organizer of the next wave of quality housing and job generating retail and neighborhood supporting uses and community facilities, but also are really important places for convening and connection. And so our process, again, in this very short window of time that we've been here, was to review a good deal of briefing materials, including the Memphis 3.0 plan, which you spent literally years and uncounted number of public meetings thinking about and engaging about. We toured the study area and really got to kick the tires, so to speak, in each of these parks and the surrounding areas. We had a whole afternoon of really remarkable conversations with a whole range of diverse stakeholders, of community residents, business owners, foundation folks, people in public agencies and the like. And then we began kind of locking ourselves away yesterday and began sort of teasing out some findings and some recommendations based on the work that we as a group have done in other cities, and people will speak to that. And then here we are making kind of a summary presentation in this sort of speed dating exercise that we have here with you. And then there'll be a published report that'll come out that the ULI staff will prepare in the coming weeks, and so there'll be something that formally documents this. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists who you're going to hear from next. Marcel Acosta is the Executive Director of the National Capital Planning Commission in Washington, D.C. Nan Rohr is the president of Midtown Community Benefits Districts in Baltimore, Maryland. Ryan Cambridge is the planning practice leader at the design firm Browning, Day, Mullins, and Deerdorf in Indianapolis, Indiana. Ray Brown is president of Ray Brown Urban Design here in Memphis, Tennessee. It was a tremendous resource for us sort of locally on the ground. Brian Smith is senior economic development coordinator for the city of Durham, North Carolina. Beth White is the president and CEO of the Houston Parks Board in Houston, Texas. And Daniel Betts is the director of recreation, Cincinnati Recreation Commission, Cincinnati, Ohio. And I really have to thank our staff who made all of this possible at ULI, Sarah Hammersmith, and Will Herbig, and NRPA, Jen Stromberg. So with that, I will turn it over to Marcel.
Thanks, James, and good morning to all of you. And thank you for your hospitality. We had a wonderful time in your city, and we spoke to many of you and were able to get a great tour of this neighborhood. So what I'd like to do right now is maybe set the table for what's to come, and also give you a sense of what we observed during our tour of the community, as well as our conversations with many of the people in this room. So we really want to start with your strengths, because we tend not to think about those things in our communities, but if you really want to consider viable parks in a viable community, you really need to work from your strengths. So that's really what I want to focus on first. And the first thing is you have good bones, and you're probably going, what does that mean? It really means you have a great structure in terms of your streets, your blocks, and your parks, and how they're laid out and how they're well connected throughout this community. And these are really building blocks for your future, that you should not take them for granted, that many cities are looking for that type of environment or that type of setup as they're redeveloping and reconceiving their communities. You also have a largely intact street grid, so why is that important? It's for walkability. It's for access to your parks, that you're able to walk from your house to your local parks very easily. A lot of communities don't have that. They have cul-de-sacs, you have to walk on a highway, they may not even have sidewalks for you to get there. So that's really a strength that we saw in this community. You have a great location, that you're minutes from downtown, you're near the river, you're near MLK Park in Stacksville. You have the benefit of location that other places don't have, and that as you're kind of reconsidering how this community should grow, you really need to think about, how do I take advantage of this very important locations? How can I make these greater connections for my parks and for my housing and for my community to these other great places in the community? You have that structural advantage. You have multiple parks in a small area. So what do I mean by that? It's not only about numbers, but you have different scales and different types of parks, ranging from what we see here at Gaston Community Center to the small pocket parks like Texas, where there's a play lot. So you really have a wide variety that serves a variety of users. You have lots of community assets and also a close-knit community who wants to help. And I was really inspired by many of you who spoke to us about your vision of the future, that you care about your communities. It's your residents, it's your business leaders, it's your church leaders, the CDCs, and also the people who work here in the libraries and in the community centers. They make a difference and they care. And also generally we've seen a good level of maintenance of your existing parks. And I'll give a caveat that this is during the winter on a weekday, and that we also acknowledge that maintenance issues are also different during the summer, but it was very well kept. As in terms of facilities, they do need consider some changes over time, but they're generally in a good state of condition compared to other places that we may have seen. Next slide. Now, some of the challenges, and we want to talk about these challenges because in any planning that you may be doing in the future, in any reconsideration of these communities, you also have to address these very fundamental issues that you face. First is the loss of population, and we all know that this community's seen population loss over the decades. But what does that mean for parks? That means fewer users. That means you see fewer people in these spaces. And that's kind of a vicious cycle. So one of the things is that everything's related. Building more housing, putting in more businesses, rebuilding the community in a way that meets your needs is really an important part to making these parks really successful. You'll hear some ideas later on today about that. Also, limited visibility to some of the parks. You do have some parks with great visibility, such as Gaston, such as South Park. They are fronted by major streets, but there's some of these parks are tucked in. And that, there's one by a viaduct, for instance, that really leads to a perception of safety and security issues. So how you design those parks in the future, how you consider the neighborhood around it as it develops in the future is something that we all need to think about. Also, the lack of a tangible community brand or identity. So that may sound like marketing speak to you, but I think part of it is it's more important to the community itself. Who are you? What do you want to become? What do you want to say to the community at large in terms of who we are? So it's one of the building blocks here. These parks serve a purpose. They mean something to people, and that's all reflected in your community identity. So it's really the authenticity part of rebuilding your communities. Also, things that you know of, crime, poverty, are really affect how we perceive the space. Perception is reality in a lot of cases, that even though this park may be safe, the community may be safe, the perception of it in terms of how the appearance of the surrounding communities, the vacant lots, the lack of buildings, even trash in the parks or around the parks really leads to a perception problem. So while you're working on fundamental safety issues in and around the parks, you also have to be cognizant that appearances do matter, and it really leads to whether people want to enter a space or not. Also, we're talking about health, and that parks are one part of the building block to good health, good community health, but also access to good food, supermarkets, even growing your own gardens, vegetables in your gardens are all part of this notion of building healthy communities. Being able to walk to your parks and being able to walk to your grocery stores are really important to a community. So as you redevelop and think about how what this community can become, those are all essential building blocks for your future. And then finally, this notion of what role parks play in your planning, and what role does it play in your development. So great cities understand the value of parks and open space. I worked in Chicago. I currently work in DC. We had political leaders who were committed to great open spaces. They didn't see it as a luxury or an add-on to good community or economic development. They saw it as fundamental to good community development, and they made the investment, and they had the political courage to do things, not only the large stuff like Millennial Park that you might see in Chicago, but investments in small neighborhood parks that are vital to your community. So if we leave you with anything, it's really that it's not a luxury, it's part of your basics, that you need to consider it as much as you do affordable housing, jobs, transportation, open space. It's not a luxury. So you'll be hearing this over and over again, but I think you need to view our presentation today in that framework. It's really a part of your development. It's really a part of your community. It isn't an add-on. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nan.
So I clearly didn't have enough coffee this morning because I didn't say the thing at the very top of my list, which is to thank our hosts, right? So Anna Holtzclaw, who's the head of the ULI Memphis District Council, thank you so much for doing everything to keep us well fed and organized. Marcia Allen and Amy Collier at Parks Division for a great tour and all the insights, so thanks so much.
Okay, good morning everybody, and likewise I'd like to say an extreme thank you for your hospitality this week. It's been great to get to know Memphis in a different way. I'd like to first off commend all of you. You have done a lot of the heavy lifting already, a comprehensive plan. I believe this was your first update in almost 30 years, is that 25, 30 years? We did the same thing in Baltimore and it sucked up about 3 years of my life, right? And a lot of meetings. So you did that Herculean task, and as a city you came together and you made sure your fellow Memphians, your voices were all heard. So bear with me for being mildly hokey and go ahead and humor me, and please just turn to your neighbors and tell them, I hear you. Loud and clear. So let's together, I hear you, right? And that's what you all did. Great. See, former school teacher, right? I appreciate that level of work that you all have put in, and you need to respect that about one another and about yourselves and give yourselves credit for that. Throughout that process, and at the end of that process, you said that you value land, you're connected communities, and you're a city of equity and opportunity. Now is your time. It is your responsibility and charge to carry these tenets forward and weave them into your policies, your planning, and your priorities. Your Parks Master Plan, that should leverage Memphis 3.0 at every opportunity. It's easy to be overwhelmed by plans and pages and to-do lists and thoughts and priorities aplenty, right? I come from one of the most challenged cities in the country. I make no bones about that. We have a lot of things that we struggle with. But what we have found is that when we hone in and focus on one thing at a time and do the best we can in those spaces, that we really have seen our biggest opportunities manifest themselves. So this process, this week for all of us in this room, and for those of you who've been along for the fun ride, is a chance for us to really hone in on an underserved section of the city and really help you devise some ideas that work not just in this section of the city, but also can help you as you plan in other aspects as well. So in our 2.5 days here, as already mentioned, we talked to a whole bunch of people and we saw a handful of your parks. And we're actually really excited for the opportunities that are in front of you, and we hope that you are as well. There are a handful of things we've heard, but most loudly we heard there are challenges around policing, lighting, and a feeling by residents that they aren't necessarily heard by the city when it comes to very clear maintenance pieces, policing, lighting, etc. There is agreement that some of the best parks in Memphis are not actually run by the city, but are in a partnership with either a nonprofit or even our Shelby County Park. We've also heard that there are plenty of opportunities, right? Because challenges mean opportunities on the flip side. It's a chance to prioritize equity and equality in your priorities and in your budgets. And this is also a chance for you to bring in your community of all ages and have them be fully engaged in the work that you're doing. You'll hear so much more about this as we go through the rest of the presentation and hear a lot more detail, but I want to give you the snapshot of our recommendations for you. As you've already heard told, parks are precious. Hold on to those spaces, invest in securing them, because it's really hard to get them back later. Connected networks of parks encourage more usage, provide alternatives for mobility, create healthier, more equitable cities, and what we've found with our waterfront promenade, for example, take people from one neighborhood to another that they never would have imagined going to. Great cities all around the world value their parks as pivotal to their economic strength, and they create strategies with those parks in mind and treat them as neighborhood anchors. Neighborhood anchors. Keep that in your heads. There are many ways to strengthen communities even when the market isn't readily visible. The market's always right around the corner in some instances, and you need to latch on to making sure you're prepared for that. You need to tell the stories that are happening in your parks. Good things are happening here, and there are people who love these spaces. Be sure to tell their stories. And finally, do not go it alone. Parks impact every aspect of our lives in a city and thus are important to all of the city departments and should be treated as such. Parks are not only the Parks Department's responsibility. So that's a lot to absorb, and it's all relevant to where you are as a city. So to help you move forward, we're going to give you some key steps and examples from our experiences, and without further ado, here's Ryan to start that off.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I think after we sort of did the big deep dive, right, drinking from the fire hose for the first day or so, we all got together and said, well, what do we do with this information and how do we leave the community with a meaningful trajectory? So the first suggestion or recommendation from us came really easily, which is just keep doing what you're doing right now. Don't stop taking care of these spaces. Don't stop investing in the infrastructure in these communities. Parks are precious, and we really want to make sure that there may be some challenges today, but you got to keep doing what you're doing right now as you think about some of these bigger moves. So that's an early win, so we want to encourage you there. So keep going in that aspect. A second one is we think about through the lens specifically of community development and what role do parks play in that community reinvestment. One of the things that you can do as a city, and this is bigger than just the Parks Department, obviously, but is work to create shovel-ready parcels, right? So remove any barriers to development. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about what some of those might be, but one of them is with the land that you have access to, that you can control, get it ready, primed, and prepped for redevelopment, and redevelopment that fits the context and the vision of the community. So it's really important that you as a community get ahead of that and be the driver of that. So, deal with things like, we heard a lot about title issues, right? About how you deal with vacant land, how you take control of it for the public good. Removing some infrastructure. All of these things are things you can work on before the market catches up with you. So things to work on now. One of the most important recommendations that we have, and again, we're going to sound like a broken record here, but parks often are found at the intersection of numerous different city systems, if you will, or the overlap of numerous different city departments or agencies. And as such, community redevelopment that involves parks or relies on parks needs to be approached in a really cross-agency, multidisciplinary way. So as you think about moving forward and embracing a really progressive view of the power of parks within communities or as city building tools, working with hand in hand other agencies is going to be absolutely critical. And that's not just on the policy level, that's on the design, planning level, and I'm going to get chased out of the room, but also on the funding level, right? So we all have to work together for these shared goals and coordinate effectively. We're sort of at the early stages, right, of thinking about, there's lots of potential for South Memphis, but we're at the early stages of the market realizing that, which is a good place to be because we have the opportunity to protect the neighborhood in that process. But at the same time, we want to serve as a city as catalysts for encouraging the type of redevelopment that we want to see within the community. So there are things the city can do. And one of those is being one of the risk takers early on, right? When you bring people into a neighborhood that is redeveloping and changing, there's some risk there. So things that the city can do to help minimize that and encourage positive redevelopment are, providing incentives to developers, that make sense. Leveraging some of the successes you've had doing this in other neighborhoods, right? This is not the first neighborhood in Memphis to see some really quality, affordable new housing infill go in. And focus on providing critical housing or facilitating housing around a critical mass, next to and adjacent to a park. So there's a lot of benefits of doing that, and creating that mass where you start to feel a tangible change in the neighborhood is really great, especially when it's coupled with adjacency to a park space. I think, I'm from Indianapolis, but I've done parks planning all over the United States. And usually when we think about parks, it's through a systems lens. How do all the pieces and parts work together? And I think one of the great opportunities you have with the study area specifically that we looked at, while there may be some infrastructural challenges or challenges with conditions and things like that, man, you have a great network of a fairly wide array of park types and sizes in a very close proximity to one another and connected by streets that have decent connectivity, and in most cases, and this is an example of South Parkway, a good amount of right-of-way to work with. So it's important to remember that a user or a visitor's experience of a park doesn't begin at the park. It begins the moment they try to get there. So thinking about how people get to your park spaces and move between them is not just important from an experience standpoint, but also from a transportation infrastructure standpoint. So making sure that people are able to move safely and freely as a pedestrian or as in a motor vehicle between your facilities is really important. And we think this aligns with a lot of the recommendations that you have in your transit master plan and the Big Jump project. So this is the next slide, just an example of I'm not going to go into all this, but this is all the components of the study area, right? You've got your parks in green. Anything that's a purple color is a place of worship. So there's lots of different churches, neighborhood partners that are out there. Yellow are schools, and red is sort of neighborhood scale commercial. So if you look at stitching all of these assets together with complete streets, so streets that are safe, friendly, and encouraging for everyone, regardless of what type of mode of transit you're taking, you can see how really easily this whole system works together as a network. And that's a great asset that many communities are trying to recreate from scratch. So you have the bones there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ray, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the really big ideas and opportunities in South Memphis.
Thank you, Ryan. James mentioned the concept of placemaking, and that's a fancy planning term for creating an area where everybody feels like they're in a community and around some center. And parks, among other things, can be the heart of a neighborhood. They're a focal point, really. They're a public living room where everybody gathers and celebrates their commonality and shares and gets to know each other. And one of the best, actually, analogies I heard was, when the revolution comes, where does everybody go? They go to the center. They go to the park. They go somewhere where they can be together. I liked Ryan's necklace of green, the pearls on a string, and how they form a network and form a path, a continuous path. And it occurred to me that, and my friend Jimmy Tucker over here can attest to this, it would be a great opportunity for something like a South Memphis Heritage Trail, where not only can people get exercise, but they can go from station to station and learn about the history of South Memphis and the people who made this community what it is today and what it used to be and what it can be again. So connecting things becomes important. And here you can see that not only does the study area connect the parks together, but it connects those parks to some of Memphis's great assets, to Soulsville and Stax Academy, to Lemoyne College, to downtown, to the emerging South City neighborhood, and to MLK Park itself. There's a lot here, and there's a lot, as you all know, downtown is growing by leaps and bounds, and that is moving south. That prosperity is moving south, and South Memphis has got to be ready for it when it gets here. So connecting together becomes important. One thing that needs to be remembered is that parks can spark community renewal all by themselves. And by community renewal, I'm talking about investment. I'm talking about money in everybody's pocket. Yours, mine, everybody's. Building from that strength, the strength of the park, can have spin-off effects to creating new development, to creating greater tax revenue, to creating jobs, to creating more access for people to health and health care. It's a phenomenal generator of economic and social and community activity to have a network of parks the way South Memphis has. Parks do matter. Look at these numbers. $154 billion generated by parks across the country, and 1.1 million jobs generated from the existence of parks. Parks matter. And to look at them as an add-on, an extra, something to be dealt with sort of at the end of the trail, gets our priorities misplaced. So we really need to look at parks as a practical financial asset. We need to value our parks and give them more importance. We need to create a knowledge base of how the parks are used and what the benefits of investing in those parks is to the city. Without that knowledge base, we're just guessing. But with a knowledge base, we can target investment so that it makes sense and gives us the greatest return for our dollar. And Brian's going to run you through some additional methods to make all this work.
Thank you, Ray. So I'll begin by saying something that many of my colleagues have already mentioned, and I think that's something that you all kind of inherently know, and that is that parks can't be thought of or considered in a vacuum. Parks and successful parks need active, lively neighborhoods surrounding them in order to make them successful. One of the best ways to do that is through fostering entrepreneurship and small business opportunities. And in fact, you all here in Memphis have an opportunity that we don't have in my community in Durham. Durham for many years had lots of disinvestment for many decades, and then the opportunities came really, really fast. And so that led to a lot of displacement, a lot of affordable housing challenges, and we're grappling with that. The opportunity that you all have here in Memphis is that you have a chance to get ahead of that before the investment that's sure to come to Memphis, so that the people are actually prepared to take advantage of the opportunities and won't have to face some of the displacement that we've felt here in my community in Durham. So in terms of specifics of ways to get there, one of them is to increase your access to real estate opportunities. One thing that we've heard while we've been here in Memphis is that there's been a challenge with people getting clean title. I think Ryan mentioned that a little bit. So what other communities have done is they have worked to purchase properties that have delinquent titles, land bank those properties, and then prepare them so that the investor gets clean title. Cincinnati has done that with its Cincinnati Land Trust, and we've also actually done that in Durham with our Durham Community Land Trust. And so those are models, and there are others around the country that are good ways to ensure that you have good properties available for your investors. Closer, okay. Another opportunity is to increase micro retail opportunities adjacent to your parks. So Atlanta is also a good example of this. They are doing something called micro ATL. So it's connected to placemaking, and it's a good way for small businesses who are operating at a very small scale. You can kind of see in the picture there are some kind of food trucks. So there's an opportunity around in the areas adjacent to your parks to connect them to small micro enterprises. Access to financing is another issue. A way to overcome that is to increase micro lending opportunities through CDFIs. We know that here in Memphis, the Works is doing a lot of that work in the community just outside of South Memphis. But there's also opportunities to connect to CDFIs like Self-Help, which operate nationally, to connect some of your small business to micro lending opportunities. We know that small businesses in particular have a challenge in the $25,000 and below space. Big banks don't really like to lend in that space, and so CDFIs are a good space to get small businesses the resources that they need. Next slide. Inclusive procurement is an area that actually Memphis is really doing a really good job. Your partnership with the Living Cities Initiative is actually a model. So in the past 5 or 6 years, Memphis has done a really good job with increasing its public dollar spend with minorities and women-owned business enterprises. So the recommendation here is really just to kind of keep up the good work. The Parks Department obviously also has a big spend, so a recommendation is to continue to look for opportunities to increase your MWBE spend, and also to partner with a lot of the larger scale private developments that you have here. So the Memphis Medical District, Union Row, are big private developments where you have an opportunity to increase the amount of dollars that go to your MWBEs. Technical assistance is something that's really important. Very small enterprises really need a lot of help in getting their business acumen together. They're very good at the technical aspects of their business, but they need business acumen, and there's a lot of intentionality that's required there. So what cities have had success in doing is encouraging cohort-based trainings. So here in Memphis, you guys have a real estate development initiative through ULI to partner with organizations to help develop small-scale developers. I think you just graduated your first cohort here in December. But other cities have done the same thing around other areas. Charlotte's doing it around opportunities at its airport. Lawrence, Detroit is doing it, and we've done it in Durham with a cohort based solely on women-owned entrepreneurs. And so that's something that we'll encourage and we'll put into to the study report. And finally, working on your workforce development. And so, you've got a large youth population here in South Memphis. One thing that other cities have done is to encourage public-private youth employment programs. And so Cincinnati has a youth employment program where they partner with about 800 students. Durham also has one. We partner with about 200 students to give them jobs throughout the summer, to increase their job training skills. And it's also a good way to put some money in their pockets. And so that's something that I think Epicenter here is doing, but we'd encourage them to continue that and to continue to moving that into South Memphis. And finally, partnering with Epicenter to focus on the South Memphis district. So, seems like Epicenter is doing a really good job in terms of bringing big dollars into Memphis. I think one of the recommendations is to focus that on the South Memphis district. A lot of opportunities and a lot of chance to get people prepared in advance of the development that will surely come to South Memphis. And so focusing on this area is one way to ensure that we kind of sort of spread the wealth. So with that, we've sort of talked about the community development and how community development connects to the success of your parks. And now we'll move on to Beth and Daniel, who will talk about the nuts and bolts of actually making it work.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. It's just a delight to be here, and it's fun to sit up here and watch you in this cathedral to basketball with this beautiful red arch. It's really quite an inspiring place to be. What was that?
Hoop City.
Hoop City, okay. Maybe we can play a little bit afterwards. It's just a delight to be here, and having been here for a few days to get to know your parks in South Memphis and many of you in the audience. And one of the things that Danny and I really want to talk about, or Daniel, is really as you're embarking on this parks master plan, what you need to be thinking about. And I think fundamentally is just to remind everyone that livable communities don't just happen. It's really all about the people and the work that each of you are putting into this every day. And the way we began our exercise was really to listen, and I think that that's something that all of us need to do more of, and as Nan says, to hear one another as you're working in community to create a vibrant park system and a livable community. And this really takes vision. Your Memphis 3.0 plan, I think, really lays that out in a very broad way, and it was very impressive to us that 15,000 people participated in that planning effort. So you're really launching your parks master plan with the right momentum as you call out in your overall plan. And it takes leadership at all levels. Marcel talked about the political leadership that we've seen be so effective in cities like Chicago, where I also used to work, or in Houston with Mayor Sylvester Turner, but also the two prior mayors who helped a real parks renaissance in Houston. We in Houston suffer from some of the same challenges that you do. We're a big spread out city. We're 630 square miles with nearly 3 million people, but it's not a dense city. It's a very vast spread out city. So how do you serve people? We have a long way to go before we could ever be close to the 10-minute walk standard, just because we're so spread out. So again, think of that as an asset with what you're doing here. One of the other things that we really wanted to have you thinking about, and I was talking with Amy, your really talented grants person here at Parks, is collaboration is hard. It's about sharing. It's about really labor, as Amy points out, is the middle of that word. And you shouldn't shy away from it. You're going to have hard days. It's going to be tough. But I think what's so important in all of our lives, things that are hard are usually the most rewarding. So we want to talk about community engagement, which leads to strategic partnerships, and how you really do need to be thinking about how you're engaging folks who use these parks, because you have all kinds of people who use these, and how do you design your parks and how do you design your programs to be serving those folks. I also want to compliment the Memphis Parks and Neighborhoods Department, who made an investment in community engagement and is staffing up so that people do have a point of entry. And Marcia and her team, who will be working with you, it's a really important thing, and it says a lot about how important that is to Memphis Parks. One of the things that we learned in talking to folks was about public safety being the #1 priority. And in the work we've all done, safety is always the first thing that people think about, whether it's crime or whether it's physical safety and equipment being safe. But one thing that we heard about in our, go back, would you? in our conversations and discovered is some really important relationships that Memphis Parks have had with your police department. And we heard about an example in Denver Park where a community leader went to the police department and said, we're having problems in the park. And through our great officers here, Officer Bullard and Officer Ware, they were the two officers who were fundamental to that park becoming a place where the police could connect with youth, could connect with the Memphis Parks and Neighborhood Department. And what really was important as an illustration is how parks can play a critical role in making our communities safer. And Brian and I interviewed these two officers, and it was interesting that the kids that they worked with 4 or 5 years ago in Denver Park, they stay in touch with, and they volunteer in police football league. So we're recommending to Memphis Parks reestablish those relationships with the police department because they do want to learn the community because it helps them in their own work. One of the other real strengths that you have are your faith-based organizations. We sat down with Reverend Moore from St. Andrews to talk about what their goals were at their church, and then the principal Cooper, who has the charter school there, and heard really interesting information about what is already happening that you can build on. The principal told us about a Kaboom project that was the single most impactful thing that they did in terms of engaging people in a hands-on project that brought them together and created an asset for their park. And her advice was to continue engaging people in these activities, that they're building something together. And we find examples of that around the country. The other thing that we've learned about is the needs for people to get social services for either health issues, whether it's depression, AIDS, whatever needs they have. And we've learned from the Parks Department in our own work in Houston as well that parks are a place where you can really come together and learn about what that community needs. And in your park planning, try to figure out what those needs are. And if you can serve as the connector to the resources that they need, it really does pay off in benefits. With all of the community engagement work, it really does lead to strategic partnerships. And one of the exciting partnerships that we took on when I worked in Chicago on a project called the 606 went through 4 different communities. The East End was very different from the West End. And what we found is to engage with our arts community to find a way to bring folks together through the arts as an engagement tool, but also similar to the Kaboom story, something that people created together. And here's some images of artists who we commissioned, local muralists, to come really participate in how the park was designed and also how to celebrate what was important in those communities. And in terms of funding, what we did was reach out to non-traditional funders. We never would have gotten this money to build the park, but we got money to pass on to cultural institutions in the neighborhood that helped us create the arts program, create the opening celebrations and ongoing programs in the park. So I really encourage you to think about kind of non-traditional partners. And the other thing that art does and what artists do for us is make us look at the world a little differently. And it's a really wonderful way to create something that's playful and joyful in our communities. Community gardening is another way to do that. We talked to the folks at Knowledge Quest who teach kids about the culinary arts, and they use the park here for their programming. So we encourage them to move their family dinners outside into the park, share a meal, invite the neighbors, create an herb garden that you're using those herbs in the food that you're preparing for the parents and the people of the neighborhood. So these real fundamental connections that seem so simple have such power to share a meal with your neighbors. And the other types of strategic partnerships that we're working on in Houston that I wanted to share with you is the the cities in America right now are investing in parks at a level we haven't seen since the turn of the last century in the City Beautiful movement. Businesses understand the value of beautiful civic public spaces. But in Houston, we have beautiful showcase parks, millions of dollars raised by private conservancies, which are wonderful. They serve the entire city. But our neighborhood parks have not received the same level of investment. We have 380 parks in our city park system in Houston. 160 of those are neighborhood parks, and they don't have the level of investment. They don't have friends groups. They don't have conservancies. Our organization, we work on a mega project called BioGreenways, which is a huge down payment on equity for parks in Houston, 150 miles of linear parks and trails along the bios. But what about the neighborhood parks that kids are trying to get to that have been underserved? So the mayor last year challenged us to work with Parks and Recreation and the business community to lift up our neighborhood parks. So you see the copy of our brochure. I'm happy to make it available. It is online. But we're engaging with the Greater Houston Partnership, which I think is probably the equivalent to your chamber, or Ray, I think it's called EDGE. But they have embraced this project because they know for their businesses they need to attract employees, they need to retain employees, and make Houston a livable place. So we're challenged with taking the 50 neediest parks, matching them up to 50 companies with the primary purpose of engagement and hands-on volunteering, because companies have volunteer programs, so try to get their attention focused on the parks. But we're also asking for financial contributions, so they would cover half of the budget for improvements, and the city would put up the other half of the money, so we're leveraging investment. And I'm happy to announce we've already signed up 7 companies to help us with that effort. The other big partnership we have is with our seniors. We have a national partnership with AARP, but we also have Sue from Sassy Silver Steppers, who lives along Green's Bio, and she goes out with her girlfriends now on the trail because they have a safe place to walk and get their exercise and be part of the community and have an interaction with their neighbors. And it's really very inspiring to see. And one thing I wanted to say about our medical community in Houston, we have the Texas Medical Center, which is the largest in the world. They have 150,000 employees in the Texas Medical Center. So Memorial Hermann, one of the largest hospital chains in the world, we reached out to them and said, you're all about health, so how about partnering with us? So now every year we get a small challenge grant to do small gift fundraising, and even if it's $1, they will match it because people want to contribute to their parks, and there's really great power in this. But more importantly, their doctors are signing up with us to do walks with docs. So doctors who are willing to go out and actually walk with neighbors, talk about the value of parks to their health. And it starts slowly and incrementally, but when you get a partner of that magnitude and influence, it really does make a difference. So with that, I want to turn it over to Daniel, and thank you again for having us here.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me? All right, I'm gonna forego the mic if that's okay. We got to use the mic because we got to do the video. Okay. All right. Well, good morning. How many of you live in South Memphis? Currently live in South Memphis, near South Memphis. Used to live in South Memphis. All right, good. Okay, just wanted to know who I'm speaking to. And then how many of the folks in this room are from the park board? Park board, or the park, what do you call it, commission? Yeah, you're going through naming issues, I get it. Park division? Stand up, those who are working for the park division. Let's give them a round of applause. Now you've had your 2 minutes of fame, you can sit down. So I wanted to just kind of call that out because as a career parks and recreation person, and having grown up on the south side of Chicago, then moved to Denver, Colorado, then moved back to Chicago, and then moved to Cincinnati and where I'm at now. Parks and Recreation, we oftentimes don't get the applause. We oftentimes don't get the accolade for the great work that we do. And we do just about everything. We do economic development. We do planning. We do all those things that many folks, we do babysitting. We do policing. We do teaching and educating. All of that comes under the umbrella of what you guys are doing every single day. And so I want you to know that you are appreciated in terms of what you do. So I'm going to spend a little time talking to you about what you can do specifically today, tomorrow, and probably some things that I'm going to say you're probably already doing. And I think that's okay too. I don't want to stand in front of the projector because then you wouldn't be able to see. That's pretty tiny. I really need to get me some glasses. So facilities and maintenance, right? So these, and don't get confused by the buckets and the umbrellas that we put this stuff under, because some of it relates to things that you can do with facilities and your maintenance, but some of it really relates to what you could just be doing in community, okay? So push your partners to do more. I would encourage you to, with your partnerships, the existing ones that you have, encourage them to do more, work with them to do more. Develop and improve your maintenance standards. In Cincinnati, we took on, and let me pause for a moment and say, Cincinnati is very much like Memphis. And I'm going to say this in this way. We have issues of poverty that pretty much fall off the radar in some other parts of Ohio. We have issues of crime. You didn't have on your list of issues issues of racism. We also have issues of huge health disparities within the African American community. Our numbers for diabetes and high blood pressure in certain communities and in certain demographics is off the chart. We're leading the state in those areas. And those are not the areas we want to, much like you, don't want to be leading the state statistics, sorry. Redesigning your locations so that they are multifunctional and they're multi-purpose. So you can do, or you can serve youth, you can serve adults and seniors and everything in between. So you want to make sure that as you're designing, whether it's parks and or rec centers, you want to make sure that you're designing them to meet the needs of a very broad and diverse community base. And a lot of my colleagues have already said you want to get input from the community. Please don't. Cincinnati made this mistake. We were building things and we really didn't have a strong community engagement component. We've changed that. We will not build things without talking to youth. We will not build things without talking to adults and seniors and folks who live in that community. And we oftentimes even go even broader than that, because we realize that centers can also not just be neighborhood-based, but they can be regional draws when you do them right. Remove and replace things that are no longer of use for the community and or for you. We'll use just Gaston as an example. That baseball diamond, the baseball cage, doesn't look like baseball has been played there in a long time. You know, just take it down. That's something you can do tomorrow. You don't have to wait until you get capital dollars to make that happen. Somebody's moving the, okay, great. Consider modifying your dawn to dusk policy. This was a huge thing for us in Chicago. It was a huge thing for us in Cincinnati. People don't understand dawn to dusk. What they do understand is the park is closed at 9 p.m. Give folks a specific time that your park's open and a specific time that they close, and folks are still, know this, folks still will hang out beyond 9 p.m. That's still going to happen. But with great relationship with the police and great signage and great, again, relationships with the folks who are using your parks, folks will begin to honor some of those things. And there's nothing wrong with getting some lighting in some of these places, and doing night programming for young people as well. So think about that. Incorporate small parks as part of a regional network to develop loop trails. I think Gaston is another example of that. You do have already less than a mile, probably less than a half a mile trail that goes around the park now. Invest in that in other locations. Improve the one that's here. And again, think about lighting. Access current park assets to meet needs of the current community. To do that better, again, I guess it ties back in your community engagement, who you're talking to, how often you're talking to them, not building before talking to folks in the community. Consider right-sizing the assets and conduct audits. We've conducted audits, and I think you guys are actually looking at a park master plan, and I hope part of that plan, and by the way, the same firm that you've went through your bid process and awarded the master planning effort here, Pros Consultant, Leon Young is the same folks who just completed our plan. We spent 18 months with Pros Consultants and in Cincinnati, and they did an amazing job. So again, for Park Division folks, I certainly phone me, email me if you have questions about what we did and currently what we're doing in terms of now, because it's game time for us now. We're actually implementing our plan, and that's some fun work. Equality of resources and distributions, not equal, equitable distribution. One of the things we're doing in Cincinnati, we have some parks that our budget is very limited, much like yours. We have parks that have, all our parks have deferred maintenance, but some of our parks in the poor communities have even more deferred maintenance. And so we are not just distributing equally across the board. Again, some of this is political, was political for us. We had to get with our council, and we had to tell our story, and we had to show them why investing in places like Over the Rhine and Cincinnati made sense for the community to bring in new assets, new amenities. And what we're seeing is change of usership. Cincinnati recreation, historical philosophy, and I'm assuming by looking at and talking with you guys, some of the great people here in Memphis over the last several days, I think our philosophy, much like yours, is Parks Division and Recreation has been set up to serve the poor and only the poor, and we've changed that. Our facilities and our assets are set up to serve everybody, not only the poor. We're raising the bar, because what happens is, what we was learning is that that kind of mentality gets into the culture of the organization. It gets into the culture of citizens. And so in order to change that, you got to change the way you think. You got to change the way you look at your assets and who they're serving, and try to make them equitable and fair for everybody, and particularly in neighborhoods where you haven't had a lot of investment. You should be looking at investing more into those neighborhoods. Develop a formal strategy for partnerships. I think my colleague Beth has talked about that. You probably have agreements with the Memphis School District, which is now, I think, from our conversations, being managed by the county. But you should have written agreements, MOUs with them, to spell out what you do, how you use their facilities, how they use your facilities in Cincinnati. That is one of our strengths. We have agreements, and instead of having individual agreements with every individual school, we sit down with the superintendents, and we have agreements that impact all the schools, not just one or two of the schools within the system. So I encourage you to do that. This next one I strongly encourage you to do, and I was talking to one of the Park Division managers about this, and she asked the question, how you do it, and so I'll share with her and members of the team at a later time if the opportunity presents itself, and that is looking at your fee matrix and looking at the fact that everything cannot be free. In Denver, and I tell you, I got a lot of experience with this, and I will Now probably not be the best time to debate you on this, but certainly will entertain any questions about this. But there is a way, and we figured it out in Chicago, figured it out in Denver, figured it out. We just figured it out here. It took me 3 years to get council and to get the mayor on the same page, and then the citizens followed. And we still have some folks who say $2 membership for a kid is too expensive. It equates to less than 3 cents a day. And so what I said to our colleague here at Park Division is that it won't be easy, but if you have a commitment and you're able to tell your story, you can make it happen. So I encourage you to look at your fee matrix, because free is not sustainable. In this Park Division right now, from listening to them, the vast majority of their income is coming from general fund. They're doing very little money on non-tax revenue, and no parks and recreation program across the country is finding that sustainable. We're all moving and looking at our fee matrices, and if we don't have fees, establishing, and those of us who have fees that are too low and not near the close to market rate, we're looking to raise those fees across the board. So I encourage you to do that, or at least think about it. Consider purchasing land bank vacant properties. I think you certainly, Park Division is certainly having conversation with the land bank here, and certainly have had conversation with the schools in terms of swapping land. Continue those conversations, see where you can repurpose new land that is near where your existing facilities. I would encourage you, though, anytime you take on new land, also have a plan for capital. Do not take on new land and you don't have a plan for how you're going to maintain it or how you're going to sustain it. Because Cincinnati, we've done that. We're no longer doing that. And the difference we're seeing is once we have our capital plan for over time, how long would it take, or how much money, would it take to replace that playground after it's went in disrepair, and we have money set aside for that, it ends up being a good thing. I would also say look at your tax levy. Take a look at your tax levy. See if you can get a tax levy here. Folks are having those kind of conversations all over the country, so I'd encourage you to do that as well. And getting to the yes. Focus on improvements to foster community in the short term. Incorporate public art. Some of that has already been said. Pop-ups. We were doing pop-ups before millennials. If there's any millennials in the room, we were doing pop-ups. And Beth and knows this from Chicago. We were doing pop-ups back in 2004, 1998, and having fun with it. Trying to encourage you to do that. Paint the sidewalks, the crosswalks. Get art in your spaces, Liven it up a little bit. Music. I think you're already doing movie in the parks, but if you're doing that, get that saturated across the community. People love to come out for that. Food trucks. Get them in your parks. Youth and community engagement. Make sure that you have something for the young people other than basketball. Try to diversify your sports. Don't just look at basketball. Look at tennis. Look at lacrosse. Look at golf. You're managing golf assets. Try to do something different other than just throwing kids at basketball. And friendly competition with your peers. I mean, who do you benchmark? Who do you look at right now and say, man, they're doing some awesome things. We love to be like them, right? I guess what I'll leave you with is you guys, particularly the folks in parks, you guys are where the rubber hits the road with the community. The men and women that serve, we don't get paid a whole lot of money to do this work. I would say that you've got to, and I'll echo kind of what was said earlier, partner, collaborate with folks who are in this city that don't do the things you do. Tell your story. Be willing to tell your story. This is not I can tell you, having changed and been about change management for organizations that I've took on in terms of leadership, This is not so daunting that you can't do it. You can make this happen. It will take a commitment from you guys. I would say that parks does matter in these communities. And so all of you, the fact that you're here, you know that already. I would also say that, you know, our parks and what we do in the community is a major part of enhancing the quality of life of citizens across the city. And I can tell you that from my own personal story, having grown up on the south side of Chicago, in poverty. Had it not been for parks, I probably wouldn't be standing here in front of you, being able to deliver any message, let alone the message that parks is about enhancing quality of life. So thank you for your time, and I guess we'll entertain questions now.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your patience and for taking in a lot of information.